Trials and Tribulations, where we break down the latest FDA revelations. DAPs, that's the talk of the day. Diversity action plans paving the way. Diversity of trials, that's what we preach. Inclusivity for all, it's within our reach. FDA's draft, we're breaking it down. All diversity trials, the best part around. FDA, please, we need the shift. Diversity and trials, let's uplift. DAP, yeah, you know me. Inclusivity for all, it's the key. Diversity and trials, that's what we preach.
Top of the morning to you.
Top of the morning to you. Hey,
Good morning.
I did it this week. Who's got
Yeah.
their Diversa swag on, huh? Am I still up? Come on.
No?
Come on.
We're
No?
not in sync
Ah,
this week.
I'm out of sync here, guys. Last week I was the one not doing
Well,
it.
let's
I'm in
do
the
it.
office.
Let's do it all together next week then.
All right. So welcome everyone
All right.
to DiversiTrials, Trials and Tribulations, dedicated to the FDA Diversity Action Plan Review. I hope you're hungry because we've got some meat and potatoes today. This is the day. Before we start, we want to jump right into it. I need to show you something because it's going to be relevant here. So I'm going to go and present my screen. I want to show you this. So we keep talking about this, everyone, but I don't know if anyone's really seen it. If you go to federalregister.gov and you look up Policy Directive number 15, OMB, Statistical Policy Directive number 15. This says notice, right? Action, notice of decision. It has been decided. This is official, okay? We're not going to go through the whole thing. We're talking about the DAP today, but I am going to scroll down here. I want to show you something to show you what the 2030 census will be collecting for our populations. Yeah, see, that's why we're not going over the whole thing. Figure 2, race and ethnicity question with minimum categories only, right here, or expanded, right? What is your race and ethnicity? This is what you're going to see on the 2030 census. You see American Indian Alaskan. Okay, we've seen that. Asian, Black, or African American. But look, Mitch, you called this. They're starting to itemize. It's not just Black or African American. It's African American, Nigerian, Jamaican, Ethiopian, Haitian, Somali. But look here, Middle Eastern or North African, Lebanese, Syrian, Iranian, Iraqi, Egyptian, Israeli. We are getting detailed in the U.S. Census, folks. This is happening in 2030. This is not something that Dr. Fox, Mitch, or Hadi made up. This is on the Federal Register. Okay? So this is very, very important.
Manifest the reality. We made it up.
I'm waving my hands. This is me waving my hands. This is important. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to see this later on today, but I strongly encourage sponsors, sites, CROs, look up Federal Register number 15, look and see what the U.S. Census is collecting in 2030 and understand how that's going to be relevant to your diversity action plans. That's my soapbox. Let's get down to business.
And some sponsors have already, started listing, these categories in their clinical protocols, but others are still in denial.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important. And thank you for bringing that up and sharing that on this episode, because it comes up quite a bit in this section. And I think it's important to be able to reference now. Everyone just saw the Directive 15 and how it breaks down even the minimum requirements for race, and then kind of more the breakdown in granularity and ethnicity. But it's important to remember that minimum, because that's going to be relevant when it comes up later when we go through the guidance and some of the other documents that are referenced, because we're not meeting the minimum.
Right. And the beauty of this is, and I don't want to prolong this discussion anymore, but the beauty of this is that we need to be proactive. We have 6 more years until 2030 is reflected in the 2030 census. We need, as an industry, as in this space, we need to be very proactive and vocal in terms of categorizing, breaking down all the subgroup analysis into these categories. So it's our time to really push forward.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a great point. Just because, it might not be required technically right now, you really need to be thinking long term, especially as an organization, because some of these trials, if you get to something maybe a little bit more rare disease, they might be enrolling over several years, right? Like takes quite a bit. So you don't want to get down the road and then realize, you shot yourself in the foot.
Don't say DiversiTrials didn't warn you. We're just trying to help everyone. All right. Big love to everyone. All right. Before we start, a fun little thing. We all know I love wordsmithing. Some people hate it that I do that. They don't think it's important, in my opinion. And as Lauren Stockwell says, words matter. Okay. So line number 265. This is a sign of a scholar. And as soon as I see this, I have much more respect for whatever is written. So it says in here, the very last sentence, and citations for the sources for these data. Thank you so much to whoever wrote this to make the word data plural. That is the correct way. And so as a result, I have high respects for this section because you know how to use the word data properly.
That's it. That's all it takes.
Little pet peeve with me. Okay, they use data properly in the plural form. You know what? I'm good. I'm good with this format. So anyway,
these data.
These data. That is correct, by the way. And if you don't believe me, go Google wordsmithing.com or whatever your favorite thing is. And guess what? Words matter. Okay.
Yep. Datum is singular. Data is
correct. A datum is a single point of information. Data or the word data is an accumulation of data. Okay. So, Mitch, I'm so glad that you said what you just did. You probably introduced it perfectly. So, again, I digested this many, many times. By the way, what's really funny is the AI friend that read this in the British accent had a really hard time with the word enrollment. I wonder if it's because enrollment in Britain only has one L. So our AI friend had a really hard time with that. So anyway. I don't know. But Mitch, you just said that we really need to think forward about how things are going. Right. And for me, the opinion of this section 5A evolved. Because when I first read it, I was all fired up. Oh my gosh, they were talking about all this stuff in the background introduction and they just pruned it back and they're siloing it down to things and they just forgot all these things. That was step one. But then step two, it was, you know what? If I were the FDA and I were writing a guidance that I wanted to last the ages, I would write the processes, procedures, and expectations to be something that could last beyond the problems that it was meant to solve. Which means that if I were going to go into this is how you do a DAP, I would not add things that are problems in the background introduction because the theory is this has solved it. And so I do think that the FDA did a good job with some foresight in how to introduce a DAP and what to include in it without the assumptions that we would still be having the problems such as underrepresented, such as a lot of the things that hopefully are going to be no more once this is up and running. So my opinions about this changed after the third or fourth read.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely.
So general basic format. I don't know if you've ever sat on a data safety monitoring board or a data safety monitoring committee, but if you have, this is going to look very familiar to you. I think that they followed that playbook pretty well here. They start out just saying what this is all for. I'm just going to scroll real fast through this and we'll dig into it. They start off, this is what this is for. This is the expectations. They go in well into this is how you identify enrollment goals. They go into that a lot. They talk about the sources and the citations that you should be using and how to cite those sources. They say, like, essentially this first section of enrollment goals is like the gold standard. This is what we want to happen. And then as you go off into page 10, this is your plan B. If you can't hit the gold standard, this is your plan B. This is maybe like a minimal acceptable level if you can't meet the first set of expectations. Then they go into what you do during global trials and how you can align that with US citizens and US populations that might be using your medical product. And then finally, well, and we'll talk about this. This is by far the saddest table I've ever seen in my life. Biggest weakness of the section here.
Yeah.
A table that is a reiteration of what was said in the beginning. I'll just say that out now. That's pretty easily done. And I think it was a good idea to include a table here, but you could have done more than just cite footnotes. That's pretty sad. That's my first impression. Mitch, Hadi, what did you think of this section 5A?
So yeah, I think, again, just to kick off from the thinking bigger picture, right? I don't think there's any pharma company out there. Now, I might be wrong. I wouldn't speak for all of them, but I can't imagine there's many out there that are running trials through the FDA where they think, oh, our intended use population is only in the United States. It's the only place we want our drug to be. We don't care about anybody else. I truly don't think that that's the case. So I find it interesting that there's language that's used here, starting the second paragraph of Part A in enrollment goals, which is generally enrollment goals should be informed by the estimated prevalence or incidence of the disease or condition in the U.S. intended use population. It's pretty odd, especially when you do then get down the road and we talk a little bit more about global studies. It's like, okay, and then how they recommend restructuring the demographic information and the ethnicity information based off of some of those OMB standards that are referenced in other FDA draft guidance.
Mm-hmm. FDA, they don't have jurisdiction over the world. They are only charged with the safety and tolerability and efficacy of U.S. populations.
Correct.
So, I get it. It's like we don't want to overextend. We don't want to talk about the European Union's regulations because we don't have jurisdiction over that. So they're kind of like setting their barriers for what they can and cannot approve. And that makes, it kind of makes sense. But yeah, I agree. If you're going to go, and in that, we'll get back to it, but I know that in the global section, it says in there specifically that you have to tailor it to U.S. citizens. Even if you're testing in other countries, you have to tailor your data to the U.S. citizens who might be consuming that product.
Well, not necessarily tailoring it from how I interpreted it anyways when I read through, but because if you are conducting trials outside the U.S., even when it's referenced in that footnote, like there's footnote 48, 49 that reference footnote 46, which is interesting. Mm-hmm. Have a footnote reference another footnote always. But that takes you to the draft guidance from the FDA, collection of race and ethnicity data in clinical trials and clinical studies for FDA regulated medical products. And in that document, it does give a bit of a breakdown. It's an 11-page document. Essentially, there's five points. Part A is keeping everything in 2-question format. B is self-reporting and permitting a multiracial identity. C is ethnicity, and it has the minimum requirements for ethnicity, which is either Hispanic or not. And then race, it gives you the minimum requirements listed in that guidance document from January 2024. And it has the big 5, as I refer to as American Indian or Native Alaskan, Asian, Black or African American, white, and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. But again, that's one of those other things where they, even in that guidance document, they're referencing OMB standards and policy directive 15, but they don't have it as a standard for race to include the MENA population in multiple draft guidance documents that are referencing OMB policy directive 15, where it shows that even in the U.S. Census that is going to be an expectation.
Well, maybe they didn't. Maybe when they drafted this, it was before March 29th, 2024, like when they were putting this all together.
I
So
thought about that, but well, it's been released after that. So
so maybe they'll update that in the final publication. But that it's really important to maybe put in our notes. We would recommend maybe an update to this based off of the OMB's Federal Register number 15 on an increase, because that's really going to impact later sections that reference the U.S. Census.
Yeah. Now, it's nice that they do have the footnotes and they reference other guidance documents. You don't want to be too repetitive, right? You don't want to have a bunch of redundant information in every single document because they're slightly related. But I do think that it would be relatively important, instead of just referencing another document, to maybe explain the standards and how that looks. Because outside of the standards, or at least according to the OMB standards, when it comes to like ethnicity, you can have, no, non-Hispanic or Latino, or yes, Mexican, Mexican American, Chicano, yes, Puerto Rican, yes, Cuban, yes, other Hispanic or Latino, right? So you can get more granular. And even when it talks about race standards outside of the big five, you can get more granular. And the guidance actually that we're going to go through, it encourages that thinking based off of region, like where regionally you're conducting your clinical trials and how you might break that down. So if you are going to be throughout Asia, you have Asian, Indian, Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, other Asian, etc. So those are part of OMB standards already. But I find that interesting, though. To that point, is like, okay, well, in the U.S., then it's okay to just it's the melting pot, right? That's the whole concept. But it's okay to just have Asian if it's a U.S. trial. But we don't want to encourage granularity of someone who's Japanese and living in the U.S. citizen.
So, Mitch, what I'm hearing is you're saying that the FDA's proposed diversity action plan isn't diverse enough.
Yeah, I've been saying that for a while.
The bottom line, yeah.
All right. So,
okay.
And again, maybe, fingers crossed, when this is published and final, that kind of granularity, maybe you don't want to bake that into the actual instructions to make a DAP. Right. Because who knows what kind of granularity you're going to need in 20 years. Maybe we need even more itemization. Maybe we'll go by genome. Who knows?
Correct.
But you don't want to be that specific when you're trying to give a general guidance. Yeah. I would love to see, obviously FDA loves footnotes, right? I would love to see Federal Register number 15 as a footnote. That would be great. That would be
absolutely. If you scroll down to 232, again, it's the sort of that was mostly where the majority of my comments kicked off, and I would love to ping this over to Hadi as well after I talk about it a little bit. But when it talks about enrollment goals being informed, informed by the estimated prevalence or incidence of the disease or condition in the U.S. intended use population. So even if you think like globally, though, it's based off of disease prevalence and how we're forming our enrollment goals, which I still have a problem with statistically speaking. But globally, looking at like disease prevalence for like say type 2 diabetes, you have 1/3 the amount of disease prevalence of type 2 diabetes in India than you do in like the Netherlands or like Sweden or something. So even just being that granular on like a global level, and then how we're looking at those percentages of these disease prevalence and population, and then taking from that global level and looking more specifically in the U.S. disease prevalence of, Indians that have type 2 diabetes and what the disease prevalence looks like in the United States. And we're substantially lower in percentage of disease prevalence compared to the rest of the U.S. population. Lilly, Mounjaro, fantastic drug. Have nothing but positive things to say about it. I haven't taken it, but everything I read is fantastic, right? Body weight reduction. Everyone knows these drugs lately. 38% reduction in risk of heart failure. They're not sponsoring this at all. But get at me, Lilly. Why not? Their Summit trial had 731 participants. It's phase 3, right? So phase 3 is, even referenced up to like 3,000 patients. But that was their phase 3 trial for Summit. I believe it was like 731. And so that's not a relatively massive amount of patients. So then we break that down more and more granularity, like based off the percentage of what we're looking at. And you're going to have a small handful of people from India that are U.S. citizens right now based off of what these enrollment goals should look like. So small percentage of that, like a little handful of this 731 participants. And that is significant enough data to then determine like safety and efficacy of the drug.
So there's a section on that. There's
Right.
actually a section on that.
Victory to the same section.
Yeah, but there's a section later on, and I was gonna. So how do you? You haven't had a chance to talk. So
right, thank you. So to your point, Mitch, when statistically speaking, with subgroup analysis, and when we get that granular, and when you have less than 5. A sample size and a cell, then we get into parametric, non-parametric normality issues, and that will not be representative. And then statistically speaking, and the interpretation of this data becomes very, very, very challenging. So to your point, I like the way proportional enrollment, but part of me likes it, part of me does not. And I know where they're coming from in terms of prevalence and incidence, and wanting to really have a representative, at least sample in their, trials. But again, this is not enough. So I think the focus should not be on proportional enrollment. The focus should be on, doing the best you can, and go above and beyond just proportional enrollment. And not focus so much on proportion enrollment, which is important. I'm not saying it's not important, but they have to actually shoot higher, aim high, reach low, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
So statistically speaking, that is okay, but not okay. So you want to say something, Dr. Fox?
No, I was just saying proportional. Then that's one thing. I do like they use the term clinically relevant a few times, and that might be a little more appropriate for me when it was banning like special needs, mental disability. Anything like that, that is where I'm really appreciate the use of clinically relevant. Prime example, autistic populations, lower functioning males are very well known for epilepsy and seizures. So that's a clinically relevant population. It'd be nice to see lower functioning autistic males to be part of clinical research, to be using or testing the same exact drugs they're going to be the end users for.
Right.
That's clinically relevant. And I think that clinically relevant can also be proportional in a way for consumption of the medical product.
What about adding clinically and statistically relevant?
Statistically is sticky because then you have to separate clinical significance with like a scientific significance, and that gets very, very tricky. So I did want to start at the top and just kind of work our way down for each section, if that's okay, because there's a lot of things to understand in the guidance. One thing that you're going to see coming throughout the entire guidance is what I've identified as what the FDA is calling maybe the 4 pillars of your DAP. The 4 things that you're going to see are race, ethnicity, sex, age group. That is repeated time and time again all the way through. Those are going to be what the FDA looks at for your DAP. And I guess that's where back and forth I was thinking, man, they pruned all that stuff back from the introduction background. But I guess, they're kind of looking at it from an FDA perspective, safety, tolerability. They're trying to look at the variables that have an influence on biological interaction with a medical product. So I get it. It makes sense.
So to your point, so when we talk from the epidemiologic standpoint, all these what you've listed, race, ethnicity, sex, and age group, all these come under the person, criteria of the distribution of diseases within epidemiology. What about time and place?
So time and place is addressed later on, and by the way, they use the term SES, and I'm assuming that's socioeconomic status, but they didn't define that. But you'll see a paragraph later on where they'll start going into time and place and other considerations that you might think about. But their 4 pillars are those 4: race, ethnicity, sex, and age group. And Kelvin's got a comment. So, I know why, because I'm sharing my screen. Okay. I recommend that DAP include specific language for implementing a proportional and epidemiological model to determine enrollment goals. I think they do, Kelvin. Later on, if we go to the next paragraph down, they do kind of talk about that, specifically on how and where sponsors identify their data to justify their enrollment goals. We'll jump into that, but yeah, I agree. That's a really, really good one. So lines 215 to 224 are very interesting, and this kind of bleeds back. You remember when they were separating things out on when a DAP is required in devices versus drugs?
Right.
215 and 224 kind of match that. It's pretty much just FDA recognizes that drugs and devices are on different pathways to market, and that they're going to have different requirements for a DAP.
So they keep on going back and forth between requirements and recommendations, which I understand, but it can be a little confusing to the reader. So what I'm suggesting is, if there's any way we can actually list the requirements in one section and list the recommendations in one section, and probably just have them like in a comparison table, so that we can actually really have a good understanding of what are the requirements and what are the recommendations at this point.
Sounds like a good table.
Yeah. It's a pretty interesting. I mean, even the first sentence kicks off like they provide recommendations that may be helpful in ensuring that the requirements are met. All right.
Yeah. So it's
tell us the requirements and then we'll meet them. Same thing. But
yeah, that's a good point, Heidi. So that you may need a little more clarity in definitions versus requirements.
Right. So if I may just go on under. So do you want to? Did you want to just like go on starting line 225, the enrollment goals? Sure.
Enrollment goals. Yep.
Sure. And again, we've talked about the races. It can be more granular at this point. And then again, they might probably go on with the place and time, but this is something we can discuss later on. Now, when it comes to, I mean, for me personally, I highlight so many things here that we can talk about the methodology and the design and stuff. But more specifically, so on line 250, and that makes sense. Again, they talk about proportionate representation, even though individual clinical sites may not have proportionate representation, which is understandable if they're doing it like multi-clinic or multi.
I want to just jump in real quick on that, because that's been a hot button for a lot of sites, and I think most people maybe miss that. And there's a concern that I've seen in the industry throughout like LinkedIn and in other conversations, where there's sites that are concerned that this is going to make it more challenging for them to meet their enrollment goals, as if the diversity action plans set forth by a sponsor that they develop are going to require a site to enroll based off of those same percentages and demographic expectations, which is not the case. That's just going to and should likely have an impact and a factor in site selection. So when the sponsors are choosing sites, it's not necessarily going to be like, oh, if your site isn't going to meet this like 13% Asian and 28% Black population, you're not going to be selected. No. You're generally finding sites, from that sponsor perspective, you're going to find sites, that are going to be able to meet your overall goal from those little puzzle pieces.
It's a melting pot of sites. You're going to have a huge concentration of African American. Over here on the other side of the world, on the nation, you're going to have Hispanic. So it's a multi-site study for a reason. All of the sites will be contributing to the diversity.
Right.
You just contribute your strength to it.
Right.
We're not expecting everyone to have the same exact percentage of demographics.
So globally speaking, they would probably have to, integrate all the data together in a meta-analysis, which will probably make sense down the road.
And that's what they do anyway. There's nothing different there.
Right.
Right.
So going down, I'm just going very, very quickly over what I noticed. They on line 262, 263, they talk about when using non-publicly available sources, and more specifically, what really disturbed me is the other privately held information sources. I just would like to have more clarity on where ethical considerations come into place here, in terms of consent and stuff like that. So that would
and this is. And I get it. Well, for one, they're talking about EMRs and certain registries and things like that. But public versus private sources of information, and this could be a hot item. You're going to see entire companies building around this. You're going to see someone's going to create a grant plan of diversity and have paywalled diversity statistics and all these different things that sponsors are going to buy. I guarantee you someone's going to try to capitalize on that.
Yeah.
And so, sponsors, I'm really glad the FDA kind of looked ahead at this. And they're like, if you use private stuff, you better have a rationale. We want to know your analysis. And by the way, that's Data Safety Monitoring Board 101. So again, I see this as being kind of the FDA looking ahead and understanding how to address the challenges that they might have in the future with this.
Sure. I see where you're coming from. But it's worth, probably looking into it. But now jumping to line 291 to 294, this small bullet point at the end of this, before they start with the FDA.
I see U.S. Census data.
They say U.S. Census data, but I was actually reflecting more, when I read this, bullet point many times. I was thinking maybe we need to propose the FDA or the NIH, for all that I know, should fund some kind of formation or establishing some specific population registries if they're having limited data on, intended use population. Go ahead and fund me, or fund some registries, specific population registries. I mean, it's a segue. So as a proposed item. Going down to, and this really what disturbed me here, line 300 to 302, a diversity action plan for a multinational clinical study must describe participant enrollment goals for the entire study and should not be limited to the US enrolled participants.
Yeah.
Yes, this makes sense, but it kind of contradicts with earlier.
Correct.
You know what I'm saying?
That was my point.
No, because they say right there, right afterward, it says that okay, so it must 303 and 304. Must account for the need to enroll a population representative of the U.S. intended use population. That is where it links it back to the front.
Right. So here's the difference there. So that's as far as your diversity action plan, you have the global data that you're collecting, and then if you are conducting a study globally, right? And if you are conducting a study within the United States, they want representative data specific to the United States. So it doesn't matter if you are conducting the study in Australia or in Europe as well. That data, also fantastic data. However, all the data that you collect outside the US isn't going to apply to the disease prevalence within the U.S. for what their expectations are.
Or the population representativeness. I mean,
Right.
if you're having a study conducted or designed in Egypt, a country of 130 million, how can you break down or account for Hispanics there?
Well, right.
I mean, I'm just like going off right now. I was like, really, that was a little confusing.
So as far as I agree with you as well on that, because I saw that for studies conducted outside the U.S. in some of the other reference documents, right, where they talk about OMB standards, it breaks down the expectation to follow the same guidelines of having like their big five, but it might not be that big five. You're not going to collect Native Alaskans or Native American if you are conducting a study in Egypt, for your example, right? And then also Hispanic or not Hispanic probably isn't the way to go either if you're conducting that study in Egypt. But what they do expect is that you follow that same format of collecting, essentially like a minimum of 5 race options and then breaking down to a minimum of like 2 ethnicities. But they do have, as far as like those OMB standards in general, some additional guidance on what that might look like, right? I would talk before about even the Hispanic aspect. It's like, yes, Mexican American, yes, Puerto Rican, yes, Cuban, yes, other. And the same thing if you talk about like the MENA categories, when it shows on the US Census, how then it breaks down, the MENA region specifically. So as long as in that region, it's broken down appropriately, it should be acceptable.
And that clarification should be probably added. I mean, the bottom line, this is a wonderful, wonderful guidance or guideline. I mean, it's a starting point. Wonderful. It's giving us so many directions on how we can move forward with this. I think just more clarifications and a bespoke approach maybe on where and which population this is intended to be used, so that they can actually, each sponsor can come up with a diversity action plan, like a DAP proposal based on the study and the location and the population.
Yeah, no, I agree that the language is not very clear here, because when it mentions the entire study, that was initially like from a first like read through, that's kind of where my mind went, and then after reading about the reference documents, it must describe the enrollment goals for the entire study. That doesn't mean one enrollment goal across the board specifically, right? That's where it's like, okay, for the entire study, it must be described. However, you're going to then have those subsections and those breakdowns based off of those region specifics.
Right.
So you are going to have the U.S. enrolled participants as one section of your diversity action plan. You're going to have Australia, New Zealand as one section of your diversity action plan.
I don't think that's what. And again, we'd have to go back to the beginning and kind of go methodically. But in like before we get down to the FDA saying this is how you meet your enrollment goals, they have an entire section dedicated to enrollment goals. So from what I was reading, it's okay, we have to silo to the US. Who in the US will be consuming this medical product? What are the demographics of those people in the US? How do we identify those enrollment goals? And here's the gold standard. We have to go by the increased in, we'll talk about increased enrollment because there's your in values and statistics and everything. But so step 1, who's using it? Step 2, what's the demographics of that group? So you have to set enrollment goals not off of global regions and things like that, but demographics based off of all of these different clinically relevant, proportional, diverse populations. You pick, it's going to be some pie chart with MENA, Hispanic, African American, based off of prevalence of disease. And then now that you have those enrollment goals, what patients should be enrolled, then you can say, okay, well, now that we know the demographics we need, we can target global areas that meet those demographics to show safety and tolerability for our U.S. citizens.
Well, the way you said it is beautiful. I wish I read this on the guideline.
Yeah. So I think that's the logic behind it. But you'd have to really look back and see in like a flow matter, how did you reach these enrollment goals? How are you targeting the safety of U.S. citizens, U.S. people? Because again, that's the FDA's jurisdiction. They're not going to have a bin for New Zealand. They're going to have a bin for the demographics in New Zealand.
Right.
And then you can start talking about how you can utilize global studies to meet the demographic expectations of the enrollment goals you started up here.
Correct. For FDA expectations.
Yeah.
However, back to my other point, and I think what I was trying to get at more so is that bigger picture concept. So outside of satisfying FDA, when you think globally and how safe and tolerable your drug is across the world, to treat everybody, because you're not just trying to treat patients in the US. So I understand, like, for the purpose of the guidance and what the expectations are to meet the minimums for FDA, that's great. But globally speaking, we need to probably take an increased and more detailed and more specific approach to those regions. That's my take on it. Because there's 350 million people in the U.S. by 2030 is the expectation, and it's over 600 million throughout the MENA region by that same time. I just had a conversation with an organization earlier this week about that. So it's like, all right, so if you're taking your drug, which is fantastic, I'm sure it's going to be it's going to sell like hotcakes here in the U.S. But like, if you don't have representative data throughout the MENA region on your global study, because you're only meeting what the expectations are here in the US based off of census data that is not even available, what are you doing? You know what I mean? Like,
well, and then we'd have to look at the guidance over in MENA. That's a little out of scope with the discussion of this guidance. Right. So if it's the what?
So which guidance are you talking about over in MENA? Because I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, but as far as like the scope of review for this, if we just looked at this guidance and understand what the FDA is trying to accomplish,
absolutely,
and we held within there, that's another discussion. You could have a whole series based off of that. But if we wanted to just make comments to the FDA on this guidance, that may be a little bit out of scope.
Yeah, that's fair.
So I loved Hadi's. Mitch, 252, 257. I could have sworn you must have referenced this when you talked about the utilization of like low enrolling studies like rare diseases, right, and how it's kind of tricky to get safety and tolerability out of such small numbers. Yep. I love the FDA's last sentence, 256 and 257. However, consistent representative enrollment may provide opportunities for hypothesis generation and further study.
And I highlighted this.
I love that one. I'm like, oh my gosh, I swear they were talking to Mitch, because you were like, and for me, from a personal level, going through these deep dives and then going back to the previous videos, some of the questions I had from the previous videos are answered later in the guidance. Like this. This is a perfect example.
Yep.
So Hadi, you talked about the sources. I think that's going to be a really hot topic. What's going to be private? What's going to be public? Hadi, you said maybe NIH or one of the groups, they should start to create a registry or maybe maintain a registry to help sponsors to do this. If the FDA is going to require diversity action plans, maybe you're going to see a clinicaltrials.gov for diversity, where it's going to be, this is the standard that you're going to be referencing for demographics. So I think that the government may be in a really good situation, especially since you're supposed to abide by the census, the U.S. Census. Maybe they should create some kind of general registry that we can all reference for that.
Exactly.
So this is an interesting thing. So this whole section, all the way starting up with enrollment goals, 227, all the way down to 265, that's your gold standard. That's the one we were talking about. This is the process that you would take as your primary process. This is what we expect you to do. However, FDA does recognize that this is hard sometimes. Sometimes you don't have information. Sometimes you don't have data. Sometimes there's a weird situation. And that's when there's some plan Bs. So 267 to 273 introduces the Plan Bs. Sponsors should consider the following or other approaches to setting enrollment goals and should provide the rationale for the approach used. So this is like, if you can't meet tier 1, here's tier 2. This is the maybe what Mitch was requiring. This might be what could be considered the bare minimum. But my guess is, and do you think the FDA hit on this? You can only use the bare minimum if you can justify not doing tier 1. So in other words, you have to show us that you can't do this. If you can't do the stuff above here, then these are like the bare minimum. This is what we would accept. That's kind of like how I was interpreting it.
Yeah. I mean, to an extent, I mean, it also like does make reference and point, like what we talked about rare disease. So when you're looking at disease prevalence, like if it doesn't exist, you don't have the data to support, quality prevalence information to make that informed decision on what your enrollment goals should look like. What else are you going to use to inform those decisions to meet those enrollment goals?
And so that one right there was their third example, I think, for a clinical study designed to investigate a medical product in a population for which there are limited or no data or information to characterize the demographic. Yeah. So that's when they point to the U.S. Census. They say, if you don't know prevalence of disease across demographics, use general population data.
Yeah.
But you have to, do you think that there's going to be a time where they're going to have a preliminary DAP, and then when they collect more information, they're going to have a more detailed DAP once they have prevalence by demographic? Do you think the DAP is a fluid document or a static document for one study drug?
I don't know. To be honest, I don't know what the FDA expectations are. It's a good question. I've looked at it to where it should be almost a fluid document, like anything within clinical trials. Like you do amendments and update documents. Same thing with these goals. Like sometimes if you have significant enough data, you can cut your enrollment short from your original enrollment goals, or maybe you need to extend, right? Depending on what like a DSMB says as well. Like, okay, now you can test this drug because you hit the first 200 patients. Now we can collect it in 13 and under. And really kind of, there should be some built-in fluidity there, but that goes kind of along with like GCP as well. So if you have data, and the data that you are collecting is essentially showing you that, maybe there's an increased risk here or there, like maybe you should reevaluate your DAP for sure.
I could see a similar system to like an IRB continuing review for demographics.
Right.
You would have like a DAP renewal, so to speak. So if you as you go through the study process, you had a DAP based off of general population, and then you started to identify differences in demographics. Would you be updating your DAP? Are there ways to update your DAP based off of what you've identified in the research?
Yeah, I think maybe some of those updates for how that DAP should look and be written is likely would consist, the majority of my expectation would be that's going to consist of those approaches to meet your enrollment goals, because those should be changing if you are unsuccessful, right? Like if you have a plan on how you're going to meet these goals and that plan isn't working in your year one in your study, like you change your plan because it sucks, right? So you have to fix it. You have to pivot to see how you can then reach that population. So that
reminds me, Mitch. So how many times in this section A did you see the recommendation that the sponsor work closely with the FDA early on in the process?
Yeah. Well, same thing with like community stakeholders and community leaders. It mentions that, quite heavily throughout. And then also like in this section 5, part C, it really dives into more almost that like community engagement aspect in developing quality DAP.
Yeah, I wanted to reference it just for a line, but 316, sponsors should engage early with FDA review divisions to discuss how to address these factors in the DAP. So don't take phase 3 as your deadline. That's what I'm seeing. If you take phase 3 as your deadline, you're going to be doing a lot of back work.
That's still probably the most frustrating part that I think a lot of people kind of share in this from what we've talked about is you're missing out on phase 1, safety data for entire populations of people, like the majority, like a lot of phase 1, right? They're right by like college campuses because you can get healthy subjects. So if you're enrolling a bunch of 23-year-old like white kids, like cool. Where's your tolerability and safety as far as like the Gen Pop aspect? I think the Gen Pop concept should be a lot more specific and utilized, maybe even with like phase 1s when it comes to safety and tolerability of drugs.
I did want to note 241 to 251 is a paragraph where FDA recognizes that this could be a complete clinical development program across multiple indications. So this might be like the utilization of diversity action plans across multiple studies based off of certain safety, tolerability, and things like that. So if you're if you have one application, same drug, different indication or different TA, FDA could be considering that DAP depending on mechanism of action or safety and tolerability for your population. So there could be a time where you're going to see like a recycling of DAPs. If a DAP is relevant for one application and another, you don't necessarily have to do two.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's a great point to bring up because that's another thing I wanted to touch on this week was based off even some of the other comments you see that have already been left on the FDA website, right? And the feedback you're getting is like, oh, this is going to cost so much money and all these other things. And I know we kind of touched on that previously, but if in your ClinDev program, you're conducting multiple studies, right? It's illogical to me why you wouldn't want comprehensive, like almost conclusive data that's going to be representative of the population because you think it's going to cost a little bit more money instead of, but here you're willing to like run a completely different program or completely different study that's going to cost you billions of dollars more than maybe getting increasing your enrollment goals by a small percentage. Like it just don't, I think my frustrating take that a lot of people might resonate with is maybe just don't shorten your timelines. Keep your timelines the same. And instead of doing everything you can to bump up your timeline so you finish the study 3 months early, just continue to over enroll and meet more representative goals.
Mm-hmm. So I think we're at 52 minutes. And I think we covered almost everything in here. Again, they use the term SES, but did you see SES defined anywhere?
I didn't see it defined in here, but I know in previous sections, like in sections 1 or 2, they define it. I think it was section 2 was defined. And
then finally, Hadi, would you even consider this to be a table?
No. Before jumping into this, I would like to see more of if they can incorporate the social determinants of health and SES to be part of the social determinants of health, that would be something we can incorporate as a suggestion as well. But that goes beyond, and it's a greater discussion when it comes to social determinants of health. But it should be incorporated somewhere in this guideline. Now, regarding the table, it's not a table. I mean, per APA style or whatever style you want to consider, that's not a table.
Honestly, this doesn't provide any additional information from actually. If you look at this,
literally
compared to the top, right? It's literally the same exact thing, but they put in parentheses some footnotes and reference this and that. A for effort.
48 and 49 are footnote reference a different footnote.
Yeah, you said 48 and 49. See footnote 46. Oh boy, here we go.
Yeah. I did. Saw it.
Yeah, but to answer your question, they definitely they need to work on this table for sure.
Or just, you know what, if you don't want to add to it, just take it out. It's lost real estate. If you're worried about space,
Yeah.
this is literally embarrassing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kevin, I just saw your. Sorry, I'm jumping back and forth between two screens, but I just saw your note, and yeah, barriers to access is actually part of the social determinants of health. So to your
Yep.
point, this is a great point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, hey, section A took 55 minutes as expected. A
Yep.
lot of content. Overall, I think that these are really good comments. And so I agree with Hadi. This is a great guidance. We can poke at it all we want, but the fact that it's here, the fact that people are coming together, standing up and doing this, it's a big deal.
And we're grateful always.
Yes.
We're
And
grateful.
we are here to help strengthen it.
FDA, and we're here to help. We're not here to really always criticize, but we're trying to help.
Mm-hmm.
So B and C, sections B and C, the rationale and measures to meet enrollment goals. We are going to combine those. I wasn't sure if we were going to break it into two separate sections and then do those early next week. I think we'll do B and C in one section early next week. And we'll go ahead and try to get that scheduled after we wrap up here. But we're going to do B and C next week early. So stay tuned.
I agree. Do you want to do just a single SWOT for section 5? Or do you think that's going to get too big?
We will see. we might break it out, right? Why not?
All right, cool. So any last words, everyone?
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Kelvin, I appreciate you jumping on. Everybody as well in the comments section. Again, there should be a link on, if you go to the LinkedIn, you find the event on LinkedIn, if that's how you're watching, not through YouTube. There is a link to the draft guidance for just section 5. Hop in there, add comments, whatever you want to say, whatever your thoughts and concerns are. Even kudos to certain sections, positives, negatives. Go through a whole SWOT yourself, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and add your kind of comments in there. And then we will work to compile everything. So we'll have till basically kind of mid next week, mid to late next week. Probably want to get it out by Thursday for the SWOT for section 5. So add comments and we'll see them.
Mm-hmm. That sounds good. So everyone be sure to subscribe to DiversiTrials, follow us on LinkedIn, be a part of The Voice. This is your community forum for the Diversity Action Plan with the FDA. Again, I'll say this every time. This is your chance to speak up. Please do not stay silent about this. It is a very big deal. You saw Federal Register 15 yourself today. This is a big deal. So we need to talk about it.
Yeah, and see footnote 46.
Yeah.
I don't even mean that as a joke. Like, actually go look at the guidance. There's 2 other great documents that are often referenced. It's the collection of race and ethnicity data in clinical trials and clinical studies for FDA regulated medical products. That was January 2024. And then the other guidance that they refer to a lot was September 2017. And that's the evaluation and reporting of age, race, and ethnicity specific data in medical device clinical studies. So that is not draft document.
Mm-mm. These are notices. These are your guidances, everyone. All right.
See you soon.
See you soon. Hadi?
He jumped.
We're still live.
You were calling Hadi out.